I've had livestock all my life, and I can tell you the first thing any animal does when it's badly hurt is find somewhere dark and stop moving. That's what she was doing in my east field at 11 o'clock on a wet Thursday night in late frost month. Just stopped. She was between the fence line and the old hay barn, the big east-facing one I use for winter overflow, and the rain was coming sideways off the Veth uplands the way it does in that season, in sheets that you feel through your coat and your overtrousers and your shirt and eventually your skin. I saw her from the house window because the motion lamp tripped. I thought it was a wandering korath, big ungulate, six-legged. They come down from the high plateau when the weather turns, and they can breach a fence without trying. I pulled on my coat and my rubber overtrousers, and I went out to chase it off, because a korath in your hay barn will eat your winter feed supply in 3 days, and foul the rest. And I'd already lost one season's reserve to a pair of them 4 years back, and I was not going to repeat the experience. It was not a korath. She was the length of 4 draft animals laid end to end, maybe more in the dark and the rain. Bronze-gray scales, though I couldn't see the color clearly until later. At night in a thunderstorm, she was just a very large dark shape that wasn't supposed to be there. And the thing that told me immediately she was not going to charge was the way she was holding herself. Left rear leg, folded wrong, at an angle that didn't fit the socket. Wing root on the left side, the big articulated joint where the wing joins the shoulder, gaping, the surrounding tissue swollen enough that I could see the distortion even in the poor light. She was breathing in that careful, measured way that animals use when they've made a decision about their pain. Not fighting it, not showing it, just accounting for it with every breath, spending no more energy than each breath required. I stood at about 30 feet and watched her for a minute or two. She watched me back. Her eyes were amber in the lamplight, large, very steady, no white ring of panic. She did not posture. She did not try to move toward me or away from me. She was just waiting to see what I was going to do, the same way I was waiting to see what she was going to do, and we were both doing it in the rain. And it was 11 o'clock on a Thursday, and neither of us had anywhere better to be. I'm 68 years old, and I've been working animals on the Veth fringe since I was 19. I grew up on this land. It was my father's station before it was mine, and his mother's before that, and the family's relationship with the Veth fringe and the things that come to it has always been pragmatic. You deal with what comes. You can't run everything out, and you can't keep everything in. The land is what it is, and the creatures on it are what they are, and your job is to work with the reality you have, not the reality you'd prefer. I have seen most things that can happen on a frontier farm, including a few things I would rather not have seen. I have a sense for when an animal is dangerous, and when an animal is simply hurt, and she was hurt. And she was not going to be less hurt by me standing in the rain watching her. So I went and opened the east barn. I cleared the center aisle, moved the 2 feed racks to the wall, propped both the big side doors open so she could see daylight through. That matters with large animals. They don't like to go into a space they can't read an exit from. A creature that can see where it can leave is a creature that doesn't feel trapped. And a creature that doesn't feel trapped is a creature that will think before it acts. I checked the water line at the far end. I shook out a fresh layer of straw over the center bay. I brought in 2 of the big light stands and set them on the lowest amber setting and angled them toward the walls rather than the center, so the light was there but not aggressive about it. Then I went back to her and stood off to her left, the good side, and I waited. It took her about 20 minutes. She moved the way hurt things move when they are trying not to move, carefully, one deliberate placement at a time. The broken leg swung wide so it didn't have to bear weight on the uneven ground. Each step calculated before it was committed to. She was watching the open barn doors the whole time, reading the space, calibrating the distance and the angles, and probably doing several other assessments I had no framework for. When she reached the threshold, she stopped and put her head in first, the way a cautious animal will check an enclosed space before it commits its body, and I let her do it and didn't come any closer, and didn't move at all until she'd had as long as she needed. Then she went in. I gave her the whole center aisle. 16 feet wide, 40 feet long, good deep straw bedding I'd put down for the Korath season. I filled the big water trough from the line, 200 liters, and I'd be refilling it twice a day, and dragged 3 of the large hay racks in, and stacked them with mixed greens and dry grain, which was all I had that first night, because I was not stocked for a creature of her size and I was improvising in the dark. She drank. That was the first good sign. An animal that will drink is an animal that has decided to try. I left both side doors open, left the floodlights off. Just the low amber work lamps at the ends of the aisle. Enough light to see by without being aggressive about it. And I went back to the house and added research dragon diet and check extension files for protocol to my morning list and went to bed. I want to say here that I did not think of this as a remarkable thing to do. I understand now that it looks that way from the outside. But I am a farmer on the Veth fringe, and out here you deal with what comes to your land. Something large and hurt came to my land, and I had a barn, and I had hay, and I had water. It would have felt worse to leave her there in the rain. She was still there in the morning. I'll admit I half expected her not to be. The doors were open. Nothing had been keeping her. But when I went out at 6 in the gray frost month dawn, she was lying in the center of the bay on her good side, wing folded, the bad legs stretched out, and she lifted her head when she heard the crunch of my boots on the gravel path and watched me without getting up. I had done my research by then, 3 hours the night before and another hour before the morning round. There is more information about dragon biology and dietary requirements available in the Corda Veth agricultural extension files than most people realize, because this fringe sits on the outer edge of the Vorith Reach, and the Reach's transit corridors run through the upper atmosphere above my property about twice a month. They had never come down to the land before, in my experience or my father's, but the Extension Office has protocol documents going back 30 years. Largely precautionary, I'd always assumed, because the chance of one actually landing on your property was considered remote, including dietary guides, emergency handling protocols, and basic injury assessment charts. I had printed the relevant sections, all 47 pages of them, and read them in order. What she needed most, beyond rest and stabilization, was protein and mineral salts. The greens and grain I'd given her were essentially decorative. Nutrition for a creature of her size requires mass, and what she preferred, according to the extension file, was large prey in quantity, which I did not have in appropriate quantities for her scale. What I did have was the processing stock from the fall cull, 46 whole Karath carcasses, deep frozen in the meat locker at the south end of the barn complex. I'd been intending to render them over the winter for tallow and bone meal. I reconsidered this plan. I dragged the first 4 out and left them in the aisle, then stood at the far end and waited to see what she'd do. She looked at the carcasses. She looked at me. She looked at the carcasses again, with a tilt of the head that I would have called skeptical if I'd been assigning human expressions to it, which I was trying not to do. Then she ate. This is the thing about practical care. It doesn't require communication. It requires paying attention. I watched what she ate first and what she left. I watched how she positioned herself to eat around the bad leg. I watched what she drank and how much and at what intervals, and I adjusted. By day 3, I had a reasonably clear picture of what she needed and in what order. By day 5, she had stopped watching me with that careful, waiting assessment. She knew my schedule. She knew the sound of the meat locker door, which had a particular hydraulic catch that clicked twice when it unsealed. She knew which side of the aisle I used for the morning round, and she arranged herself to leave it clear, tucking her tail in and shifting her weight without being prompted. I had been a farmer for 49 years. I knew what it meant when an animal learned your schedule. It meant you had crossed from unknown to known. It meant you had been added to its map. The leg was the first medical problem. It wasn't broken, at least, not in the sense of fractured bone. Her leg bones were too dense and too large for the kind of fracture you see in livestock. But the joint had been overextended, badly, and there was swelling in the tissue around it that I recognized from old Korath injuries as the kind of thing that would knit on its own given time, and reduced load, but would knit badly if she kept moving on it. The extension file's injuries section was not much help with specific treatment. I had the farm vet Sella Harrow on a weekly call, and I described the injury to her on day 4. Sella was quiet for a moment. She said, "Orvin, you have a dragon in your barn." "I know that," I said. "What do I do about the leg?" Another pause. "How large is she?" "Long as 4 draft animals." "Good weight," or she was. "She's eating well now. Back on schedule." "And she's letting you near her?" "She knows my schedule." "Orvin," Sella said, "with the careful patience she uses when she thinks I am missing something obvious, I'm going to need you to understand that what you're describing is not normal." "The leg," I said. Sella gave me the information on the leg. Support wrapping if the creature would permit it. Pressure reduction, mineral supplementation in the water. She knew a compound that was used in large-scale dragon-adjacent livestock management on some of the northern stations, developed originally for large indigenous fauna with similar bone density profiles. She sent me the specifications. I ordered it on the next supply drone, and when it arrived, I mixed it according to the proportions in the file and poured it into the water trough, and the creature drank it without complaint, which told me either she recognized what it was, or she had decided some time ago that the water was safe, and wasn't checking carefully. Both were possible. The wrapping she would not permit, which I had expected. Some animals accept restraint on injury sites and some do not, and I had put her in the category of probably not from the start. Instead, I cleared the center aisle of everything unnecessary so that her path from lying to standing and back was as flat and even as I could make it, and I reduced the amount of reason she had to move by keeping everything she needed close. Food at the center, water at the center, nothing that required her to cross the barn if she didn't want to. The wing root was the second problem, and the harder one. She couldn't fold the left wing fully. The joint had something wrong in it that I did not have the expertise to diagnose from the outside, and it caused her visible discomfort when she tried to close it. A slight tension through the whole left shoulder that I could read in the scale. Alignment, the way scales shift around a muscle that is bracing. She had adapted by leaving the wing partially extended, which meant she was always slightly off balance, which put extra load on the good leg and indirectly on the injured leg, which was the last thing either of us needed. I called Sela again. Sela said, "Orvin, has she made any attempt to contact her kind? Any signaling behavior? Vocalization patterns? Anything directed upward?" "Not that I've seen." "Have you seen any other dragons in the area? Any transit activity in the upper corridors?" "There was a pass-through about 10 days back. Standard altitude, didn't descend. And she, when the transit went over, she was asleep." "Orvin," Sela said in a different tone, "that's unusual. If she's lost or separated from her group, you'd expect her to signal." "Maybe she can't," I said. "Maybe she's waiting until she's better." "The wing." A pause. "Right. The wing." Sela came out 3 days later, which I thought showed considerable professional courage, and I told her so. And she told me with some heat that she was a vet, and it was her professional obligation, and she was fine. And she drove her rover to the barn, and I walked in ahead of her and stood at the far end, and the creature lifted her head and watched us both come in, and Sela went very still beside me in the way that people go still when they are recalibrating their understanding of a situation. "She's enormous," Sela said very quietly. "I know, Orvin." Sela's voice had taken on a quality I hadn't heard before. "The scale pattern on her head. Those ridge markings, those are Vorath Reach line identification markings. I've only ever seen those in the extension reference documents." "The wing," I said. Sela examined the wing root from a distance of about 8 feet, which was as close as she was prepared to go, and she told me what she believed she was seeing. A deep muscle tear along the posterior fan of the wing membrane, with secondary impingement on the joint capsule from the initial injury event. She said it might resolve on its own over a long period of rest, but more likely it needed manual pressure work on the affected muscle. Deep tissue manipulation along the line of the tear to prevent it from healing locked, which would mean permanent reduction in the wing's range of motion and probably permanent lameness in the lower joints as the body compensated. "Are you telling me to massage a dragon's wing?" I said. "I'm telling you what the wing needs," Sela said. "I'm not telling you to do it. I'm not doing it." A pause. "I'm going to send you the anatomical map from the University Extension files and the pressure point reference guide they use for large fauna wing rehabilitation in the northern sanctuaries, and you can make your own decisions about what to do with it." She sent me the map that evening. I looked at it for a long time, sitting at my kitchen table with the extension file and the anatomy printout, side by side, and a cup of tea that went cold beside them. The map was detailed. The pressure point reference guide was detailed. I had spent my working life doing deep tissue work on large animals. Not precisely the same. Nothing about this was precisely the same, but the underlying principle was the same. Find the line of the damage, work along it, read the animal's response, adjust. Then I went back out to the barn. She was awake, watching the open side door. There was a moon that night, one of the 2 moons, the smaller one, and the light of it was coming in at an angle across the straw, and she was following something in it. A moth, I think, or something similar, a winged insect that was working the light. She heard me come in and shifted her attention to me, and I walked to the left side of the aisle, the wing side, and sat down on an upturned feed bucket about 4 feet from the joint, and I held up the anatomy printout in the lamplight. I am aware that this is a strange thing to have done. I am aware of how it sounds. I showed her a printed diagram of her own wing anatomy, because I did not have any other way to tell her what I was intending to do before I started. And it seemed to me that an animal that had been deliberately reading its surroundings and learning schedules and making decisions was an animal that deserved to understand what was coming. A surprise in a sensitive location is a surprise regardless of your intentions, and I had no interest in being on the wrong end of a startled dragon. She looked at the paper. Her eye moved over it. Not the unfocused drift of an animal that sees a shape and moves on, but the specific, tracking motion of something that is actually looking at what's in front of it. She looked at it for a long time. I held it steady. Then she shifted her weight and extended the wing slowly in my direction. Not fully, it couldn't go fully, but partway, presenting the inner surface of the joint area, the way an animal will sometimes offer an injured site when it has decided it trusts the person near it. I worked on the wing for 40 minutes that first night. I used the pressure points on the anatomy map as a guide, and I did what I had done with torn shoulder muscles in large livestock for 3 decades. Slow, patient pressure along the line of the damage, sustained rather than percussive, no sudden movements, stopping every few minutes to watch her breathing and see whether I was working the right area or the wrong one. She didn't move. She breathed. When I found a point that was doing something useful, she would let a long breath out and her head would drop slightly, a fractional release. The body's language, for that's the place. When I found something wrong, she would tense across the shoulder blades, and I would ease off and try the adjacent area. By the end of the first session, I had a reasonable map of where the damage was and where the pressure was helping, and what the difference felt like under my hands. I went back every other night after that. This is the shape of the next 7 weeks. Mornings. The feed run. 4 to 6 frozen carath carcasses from the locker depending on what she'd eaten the day before. I tracked intake because that's what you do. You track intake. It tells you more about how an animal is doing than almost any other single measure. Dragged down the aisle in a sled. I'd rigged from 2 fence boards, a length of chain, and the hook attachment from the tow bar on my utility runner. The carcasses were too heavy to carry individually, and I am 68 years old and I know my limits. The sled solved the problem, and that was the end of it. The mineral supplement in the water, measured out in the mornings. The leg joint check, which I did from the left side with the pressure gauge. A simple ring of soft leather, calibrated against a known standard, that I pressed gently around the joint and rayed for swelling the way you read a barometer, looking for the slow downward trend that meant progress. She would watch me do the leg check with the same patient, unhurried attention she brought to most things. She had a way of positioning her head so that one eye was always on me, not the watchful suspicion of the first couple of weeks, which had eased by week 3, but something that I could only call interest. She was following what I was doing. When I made a note in the log, I kept a log, a proper written one, dated entries, swelling readings, intake quantities, behavioral notes. She would sometimes shift her head to watch the pen moving. I don't know what she made of it. There was one morning, about 3 weeks in, where the swelling gauge slipped from my fingers and rolled under her left haunch, and without thinking about whether it was a good idea. I reached past her to retrieve it, my hand in the space between her foreleg and her body, and she very deliberately lifted her haunch just an inch or two, creating more clearance. Not shifting away, creating clearance for my hand. I stopped with my hand on the gauge and looked at her, and she looked back at me. "All right," I said. "Thank you." She lowered her haunch back to the straw. I don't know what she understood of that exchange. I know what I understood of it. I put it in the log. Day 22. Cooperative during gauge retrieval. Adjusted posture to assist. Behavioral shift continuing. That was not the kind of note I usually wrote. I usually wrote numbers, but it seemed important to write down. Afternoons, when the light was good. A slow walk of the property, which she did not join but which she tracked from the barn. I could see her head in the side door as I went to the north paddock or the south field, and when I came back she would look at me. A particular orientation, head tilted about 15 degrees to the right, in the way she used when she was registering my return. I noticed eventually that I was doing the same thing in reverse, checking the doorway when I came back to confirm she was there. It became habit before I was aware of it becoming habit. Evenings, the wing work. I had graduated from the anatomy map to actual feel by week 3. I didn't need the diagram anymore. My hands knew the landscape of the damage and what it responded to. The sessions had gotten quieter, the way good work gets quiet when both parties understand what they're doing and why. In the first week, she had been watchful the whole time, tracking my position with the amber eye. By week 4, I noticed that the eye was sometimes closed during the middle of a session and open again when I stopped. By week 5, she was often half asleep before I finished. That suspension of large animals who feel secure, where the body rests but the ear is still indexing the sounds around it. An animal that sleeps in your presence has made a decision about you. It has put you in the same category as its own body, safe enough to let the guard down near. The leg was responding. Sella came out twice more over the 7 weeks. She was more comfortable by the second visit, staying nearly 2 hours, bringing better diagnostic equipment and calibrated measuring tools, and confirming what my pressure gauge had been suggesting. The joint was knitting correctly, following the right pattern. She said 3 to 4 more weeks before it could bear real sustained weight. She also said, both times, that she thought I should contact the Cordovez provincial authority to report the situation, and both times I said I would think about it. And I did think about it, and I concluded that whoever this creature was and wherever she had come from, she had chosen to come to my barn. She hadn't been directed here. She hadn't been brought here. She had come on her own in the rain and the dark when she was hurt and had nowhere else to go. And she was here because she had decided to be here, and it didn't feel like my place to start filing reports about her as if she were a piece of salvage. She wasn't mine, but she was here, and the situation was going in a good direction. One afternoon in the 6th week, she made a sound at me for the first time. Not what I would call language, at least. Not language I could parse. A low, resonant sound from somewhere in her chest, more felt in the sternum than heard by the ears. A single sustained note that lasted about 3 seconds and had a quality I can only describe as directed. She made it while I was in the middle of the morning feed run, and I stopped and looked at her, and she was watching me with that focused amber eye, and after a moment she made it again. I thought about it for a few seconds. "You're welcome," I said, because it seemed, in the register and the timing, like it might be that kind of sound. She made it a 3rd time shorter. I went back to the feed run, but I was smiling, which I noticed, and which I thought I should probably keep to myself if Sella ever asked. I named her Vorath, which I knew was associated with the flight lines that used the upper transit corridors above my property. I didn't know if it was her name or her people's name, or if the distinction even worked the way I imagined it did in human terms. I used it when I talked to her, which I did more as the weeks went on, not because I expected her to understand the words, but because I had grown up on a farm and I talked to animals. It is a 50-year habit. You narrate the work. It helps both of you stay calm, and it gives the animal a consistent thread of your voice to read your mood from, which is more information than silence. "Leg looks good this morning, Vorath. Swelling's down again, down 3 points from last week. 4 carcasses today. I'm running low on the processed stock. Going to have to put in a supply order and explain myself to Fen at the depot. Wake up, Vorath. I need the aisle. I know you're not asleep." She learned her name. Or she learned that the particular sound I made at the beginning of a sentence was directed at her specifically and warranted orientation. I won't pretend I know the difference. By week 4, when I used it at the beginning of a sentence, her head would come up if it was down, and she would tilt toward me with that 15-degree angle that meant she was attending. It was not like a dog's eager, unqualified responsiveness. It was more deliberate than that, with a quality of choice in it, as if she was deciding each time that yes, this one was worth attending to. The wing was improving. The tension along the posterior muscle line was resolving the way deep tears resolve when they're worked correctly. Not a sudden change, but a gradual yielding, like a rope unclenching strand by strand over a long time. Each session advancing it a small degree, each night's rest consolidating that degree. By week 7, she could fold the wing almost fully. Not all the way. There was still a stiffness at the outer joint that I hadn't been able to reach with the pressure work, but well enough that she was no longer perpetually off balance, and the load on the leg had reduced measurably. She was not yet flight capable. She knew this, in whatever way she knew things. I knew it. Neither of us had a plan for what happened when she was, and I had made a deliberate decision not to think about it, because it was not a problem yet, and I had enough problems that were current. 9 weeks and 2 days after she arrived, I was doing the early morning grain check at the North Paddock when Darius, my neighbor Sella's nephew, he's 23, runs the Harrow station to my east. He'd been farming independently for about 2 years and was still in the stage of asking me questions about Korath management that I'd stopped, needing to think about consciously. Came pelting up my access road on his utility runner, with his face the color of unbleached flour and his voice half an octave higher than usual. "Mr. Dast," he said, pulling up on the path, "there are dragons on your road." I want to be clear about what I was thinking in that moment. I was thinking about the grain levels in the north paddock, which were lower than I liked, and would need addressing before the hard cold end set in. I was thinking about the supply order I needed to file for the carcass stock replacement. I was not thinking, in that exact moment, about 6 adult dragons blocking my access road a quarter-kilometer from the barn. How many? 6, maybe 7. I didn't count closely. Any of them hurt. Darius stared at me. "Mr. Dast," he said carefully, in the tone of someone who suspects the person they're talking to has missed an important aspect of a situation. "They're dragons. I know what they are, Darius. I asked if any of them are hurt. They don't look hurt. They look like they're looking for something. They're spread out and moving. They're not feeding. They're moving down the road toward your property." I put down my grain scoop and walked to the east fence, because the east fence has a clear line of sight down the access road for about 400 meters, and I stood at the post and looked. There were 6 of them. They were moving in a formation down the center of the road, not rushing, not exhibiting what I would call aggressive posture, but purposeful. Heads up, reading the terrain, oriented. 4 of them had coloring I didn't recognize at this distance. Darker, with ridge patterns across the head and shoulders that were different from Vorath's smoother bronze-gray scales. The 2 at the front were larger, and one of them, the largest, copper red with black ridge markings running from the crown down the back of the neck, moving with an authority that translated clearly across species and distance, had her head down and was tracking something. A scent, or whatever serves the same function. They were tracking my morning path. I had been in and out of the east barn 3 times since dawn, and the path from the barn to the north paddock ran along the fence line, and I had walked it in the early damp and left whatever I leave when I walk through wet ground. I thought about going back to the house for my emergency line, which connects to the provincial authority. I thought about Vorath in the east barn with the side doors open as always, and the swelling on her leg that was finally in the last stage of resolution and needed another week of reduced load, and the fold of her left wing that I had been working on for 7 weeks. Then I opened the east field gate and walked down toward the road. I heard Darius say something behind me. I think it was my name, in a particular register. I kept walking. The copper-red one lifted her head when I was about 40 feet out, and she looked at me with eyes that were darker than Vorath's, deep amber shading toward rust. And the expression in them was not what I would call friendly. She had the bearing of something that had been looking for something for a long time, and had run out of patience for delays. The other 5 had stopped behind her in that spread formation and were watching. One of them, the dark blue one at the back, the smallest of them, was watching me with what looked like wariness rather than hostility, which I noted as a distinction worth keeping in mind. I stopped at 40 feet, far enough to not be provocative, close enough to not look as if I were trying to run. "Morning," I said. The copper-red one watched me. Her head was slightly lowered, which in large animals can mean aggression building, or can mean close attention being paid. I read it, in her as the latter, because her weight was balanced, not forward, and her wings were folded tight. Aggression gets up on the toes. She was not on her toes. She made a sound. It was nothing like Vorath's chest note. This was structured, with deliberate cadence. Multiple tones in sequence, some of them in ranges my ears could only partially catch. The lower frequencies more pressure than sound. I didn't understand a word of it. "I don't speak your language," I said, "but I think I have something of yours. Come with me if you'd like." I turned and walked back toward the barn. I did not run. Running triggers pursuit responses in large predators, and I was not interested in testing whether that held for this species. I heard them follow. I went to the east barn entrance. The main vehicle door rolled fully open, and I stepped to the side and let them see in. She was awake. She'd heard us coming. I think she'd heard them before I saw them on the road. Actually, she'd been restless for the past 2 days in a way she hadn't been before. The wing working itself in slow, deliberate tests, as if she were measuring something. And I'd wondered if she was thinking about the next step. She was standing in the center aisle, fully upright, weight distributed properly, all 4 legs under her, including the left, and she was looking at the entrance. When the copper-red one appeared in the doorway, Vorath made a sound. It was nothing I had heard from her before. Lower than the chest note, longer, with a complexity in it that made the small hairs on my arms stand up, even though I had no idea what it meant. The copper-red one stopped in the entrance and was completely still for a full 5 seconds. Not frozen, not afraid, but absorbing. And then she made a sound back, a different register, with something that might have been a question in the cadence of it, and Vorath answered it. And the two of them went on like that for perhaps 40 seconds while I stood by the doorpost and tried to take up as little space as possible. The copper-red one crossed the barn in 4 strides and put her head against Vorath's neck. Vorath leaned into it. I went to the far end of the barn, to the small side door, and stepped through it and sat on the wood block I kept there. I kept it there for the purpose of having somewhere to sit when the animals needed the barn to themselves, which happens more often than people who haven't farmed would expect, and I let them have the space. Darius found me there about 20 minutes later. He was moving with the careful attention to his surroundings of a man who was very aware of where 6 very large predators were at all times. He pulled up another crate without saying anything and sat down next to me. We listened to the sounds from inside, which had shifted from the rapid exchange of the first several minutes to something longer and quieter, more conversational in its pacing. "What is happening?" Darius said eventually. "Reunion," I said, "I think." He was quiet for a while. "Should we? Is there anything we should be doing?" "No." "Have you called the authority?" "No." "Mr. Dast," Darius said, "there are 7 dragons on your property." 6 plus 1, I said. "Different situation." He looked at me with that open face of his, the one that doesn't hide what he's thinking, which is either a quality or a problem, depending on the context. "How long has she been here?" he said. 9 weeks. He was quiet for a longer time than usual, and he stopped. "She trusts you." "She trusts the schedule," I said. "Animals trust the schedule. That's a different thing." "Is it?" Darius said. I didn't answer that, because I didn't have an answer I was confident in. A sound from inside the barn, a short, directed tone, clearly outward-facing. I got up from the woodblock and looked through the small side door. The copper-red one was in the center aisle, facing the door. Vorath was behind her and slightly left, and the other 5 had arranged themselves along the walls, leaving a clear path from the small side door to the center of the space. An arrangement that had the quality of intention about it. The copper-red one's eyes were on the doorway. I went in. I walked down the side aisle to where the clear path met the center and stopped. The copper-red one's head was about 8 feet up, and she was looking down at me, and she had something ready in her throat. I could see the muscular preparation for it, and then she produced it, and it was long and specifically cadenced and had layers in it, and at the end she held still and waited. "I'm sorry," I said. "I don't have the language." She studied me for a moment. Then she did something I hadn't anticipated. She lowered her head until it was at my eye level, about 3 feet from my face, and she looked at me at that height for a long time. Long enough that I had nothing to do but be looked at, which is a less comfortable thing than looking. She was reading me. I was as sure of that as I am of most things I've been sure of in 68 years. The way she moved through my face with those rust-amber eyes was not the unfocused gaze of an animal in proximity. It was purposeful, attending to specific things in a specific order. Then she made a sound I hadn't heard before, single short, 2 tones in sequence, the second one lower than the first, and looked at Vorath. Vorath answered with the same sequence, then added something longer after it. The copper-red one looked back at me. She did something with her right foreleg. She laid it flat against the stone floor of the barn, claws down, the full length of the limb extended forward, and she lowered her head until it was close to the floor, too, and she held the position. I had no reference document for this. I'm a farmer, not a diplomat, and this was not covered in the extension files. But there are gestures that cross species lines, because they are fundamentally about the body making itself smaller, and I knew what I was looking at. I had seen the same grammar in 100 different animals. The postural lowering that is not submission exactly, but acknowledgement. Seeing and saying I see you. I bent at the waist and inclined my head toward her and held it. When I straightened, she had straightened too, and the rust-amber eyes were very steady, and if I am honest about what was in them, I am old enough to be honest about the things I see in faces, animal or otherwise, because I have spent 50 years reading them. What I was not quite gratitude, and not quite apology, and not quite respect alone, but had something of all 3, combined in a way I didn't have a word for. She made the 2-tone sound again, the short one, and this time she was clearly directing it at me, waiting. "I don't know what that is," I said. "I don't know what you're calling me." Vorath made a sound from behind the copper-red one. I looked at her. She tilted her head toward me in the way she developed over 9 weeks, the specific 15-degree orientation that meant she was attending to me as an individual, not just as a presence in the barn. Then she said something. It was long and it had structure in it, and near the end of it there was a pattern I recognized. The two-tone sequence, but Voreth's version was different. Longer, with something added at the front of it, something that had the quality of a weight being put on the sound. The copper-red one listened. Then she looked at me and reproduced Vorath's version, the longer one, and held still. I still don't know what that means, I said. I said it more quietly than I'd intended, because I was an old man who had spent 9 weeks doing the morning grain check and the leg swelling, measurement and the evening wing work, and at the end of the barn the animal I'd been tending was looking at me with her steady amber eyes and apparently saying something that mattered to her. And I am not unsentimental enough to pretend that doesn't reach you. Sela came out that afternoon. I called her, which I thought was more immediately useful than calling the provincial authority, because Sela at least knew what was in the barn. She brought her colleague from the Korda sale station, a younger woman named Veth, who had done her graduate research in large creature communication and spoke some basic Vorath Reach standard dialect, which Sela had apparently known about for years and had been waiting for a reason to mention. Veth arrived looking the way people look when they've been given something they've spent years preparing for, and suddenly aren't sure they were prepared enough. She stood in the barn entrance for a full minute. Then she went in. What she told me afterward, sitting at my kitchen table with her hands around a mug, and her professional composure working hard. The copper-red one was Rath Kale. She was the flight commander of the Eastern Korda Veth patrol line, which ran transit security and navigation maintenance through the upper, atmospheric corridors above my region. She had been leading a search for 9 weeks, covering a search radius that Veth described in terms I didn't fully follow, but that clearly impressed her. Voreth's full designation was Voreth Sale. She was the pack matriarch of the Eastern Patrol Line. The anchor of the flight was how Veth translated it, though she said the Voreth Reach term was more nuanced than that. The matriarch was not simply the oldest or the most senior. She was the one whose presence organized the flight's social structure, the point around which decisions were made and bonds were maintained. When she had gone missing in a storm, struck by a debris current in the upper corridor during a severe weather event and forced down at altitude, unable to signal from the ground and unable to fly out, not knowing where she had come down, the flight had not been able to re-establish its full function. They had been searching every day since. They had found her at Das Station on the outer Korda Veth fringe, healthy, the leg resolving well, the wing significantly improved. In good condition by any measure, Veth said, better than they'd had any reason to hope for after 9 weeks. Veth told me the last part with her eyes on her mug. Rathkale gave you a designation, she said. I know, I said. I don't know what it is. Keth Sorn. She was quiet for a moment. It's a Voreth Reach formal recognition designation. It means, as close as I can render it, the one who keeps the anchor. She paused. The pack matriarch is the anchor of the flight. The designation for the person who keeps the anchor safe is... Another pause. It's not a current usage term. I've seen it in historical records going back several hundred years. I've never seen it used in a living protocol context. What does it mean practically? I said. Veth looked up from her mug. It means the Eastern Flight considers you and your land under their protection, formally, permanently. It means your name and your location are in their records. She stopped, because she seemed to feel the sentence was getting too large for the kitchen. I didn't do it for that, I said. I know, Veth said. That's why they gave it. They stayed 3 days. This was somewhat logistically demanding, because 6 adult dragons plus 1 large recovering matriarch is a significant feed requirement, and my processed Karatha stock was now genuinely depleted to a level that required an emergency depot order. I called the supply depot and explained the situation to the coordinator, a man named Fen who I have dealt with for 15 years and who is generally unflappable, and he was quiet for about 10 seconds, and then he said he would process the order as emergency priority. And would I be filing a formal event report with the provincial authority? And I said I would think about it. And the order arrived the following morning. Rathkale inspected the barn in a way I recognized as professional, checking sightlines and exits, testing the floor load at the doorway, examining the water supply configuration, assessing drainage. She asked questions through Veth, who relayed them to me, and most of them were practical and specific. What had the leg presentation been on arrival? What had I used on the joint? What was the mineral supplement compound? What had the swelling trend looked like over the 9 weeks? I got my log and Veth translated the columns, and Rathkale went through it with what I can only describe as thoroughness and care. At the end of this, she produced a sound that Veth rendered as something in the general neighborhood of appreciation for precise record-keeping. I said I kept logs because it was how you managed anything correctly over time. You couldn't read a trend you hadn't recorded. Veth translated this. Rathkale made a short sound. She says, Veth said carefully, that this is correct. The 3 nights they were there, Voreth slept in the east barn as she had every night for 9 weeks. The flight arranged itself around the property in a way that I recognized as watchful but not aggressive. One of them always in the barn, 2 in the east field, 2 near the access road, Rathkale wherever she chose to be. On the second evening I did the wing work on Voreth as usual, because it was due and there was no good reason not to, and the flight watched from the sides of the barn and were entirely quiet about it. I noticed afterward that Rathkale watched the whole session from the barn entrance without moving. On the third evening, Voreth folded her wing fully, not during the session, on her own, later, when I was at the far end of the aisle and she had been resting. I heard the change in her breathing and looked up, and she had the wing closed all the way, the first time since she'd arrived. She held it for a moment, then opened it, then folded it again deliberately. She looked at me. I know, I said. There it is. On the morning of the 4th day, the day before the light changed, and the cold end began in earnest, I did the morning leg check and the pressure gauge read 0, or as close to 0 as my old leather instrument registered. No measurable swelling, no residual heat, the joint moving clean. I straightened up and she was watching me. That's it, I said. That's done. She got to her feet, all 4 of them, proper balance distribution. And she took 3 steps down the center aisle on the stone floor and stopped and stood there, her full weight on all 4 legs, and she waited. She walked without a limp. The whole flight, gathered along the barn walls, was very quiet. She walked down the aisle to the open side door and threw it into the morning light, and she opened her wings, both wings, including the left, fully, and she held them against the pale early sky. I stood at the end of the aisle and watched. The flight followed her out, one by one through the side door, and into the field, and in the morning light, I could see their coloring properly for the first time. The 2 deep green-black ones, the rich umber one, Rathkale's copper red, and the dark blue one from the back, who had been the shyest in the barn the whole 3 days. All of them substantial. All of them present in my east field on the outer court of Veth fringe, on a cold, clear morning with the last of the frost on the grass and the sky, coming up pale through the Veth upland ridges. Voreth turned to face the barn. She looked at me for a long time. I walked out of the doorway and into the field, into the pale early light, and stood a few feet in front of her. She was fully healthy, in the light. Good weight, scales with the proper sheen, the left wing folded clean. 9 weeks and 2 days from a wet Thursday night in the rain. She made the chest note, but longer than she had ever made it before, and with more in it. I couldn't tell you what she was saying, but I had spent 9 weeks reading her breathing and her weight shifts and the angle of her head and the orientation of that amber eye, and I knew the tone of it, and I think I knew the shape of what it carried, even without the words. I said, I know, take care of that leg. Don't overload the left joint in the first month back. She made a short sound. And the wing. Don't push it in cold air until the outer joint is fully mobile. Another short sound. I put my hand on the side of her head. She was warm in the morning cold. Her scales held and radiated warmth, and she smelled of the barn and the mineral supplement, and her own particular dry warm scent that I had stopped noticing as unusual sometime around week 3. I held my hand there for a moment. Then I took it away and stepped back. She looked at me once more, with the amber eyes and the steady attention and the 15-degree tilt. Then she turned and took 3 long strides into the field, and opened both wings and went up. The downbeat was like a hand pressed flat against my chest. Then the flight went up in sequence behind her, Rathkale last, and Rathkale looked back at me from about 30 feet up with those rust-amber eyes, and held the look for 1 beat, 2 beats, before she banked north. And then they were all going north, and I stood in my east field at Das Station on the outer court of Veth fringe and watched them go until the sky was empty and the grass was still again, and the only sound was the Veth upland wind. Darius came by at mid-morning. He stood in the east field with his hands in his pockets and looked at the empty sky for a while, then at me, then at the sky again. They're gone, he said. Yes. Are you all right? I have 40 carcass sleds to put back in the storage run, and the east barn needs a full clean, and I still have a north paddock grain check to finish. I'm fine. He was quiet for a moment. Keth Sorn, he said carefully. The way you say something you've been turning over in your head. I looked at him. Veth told you. Veth told everyone at the station. Mr. Dast, that's not a small thing. The Vorith reach Eastern Flight, their formal records. It's not formal anything to me, I said. I did what the situation required. It doesn't need a name. Darius looked at me. He has known me since he was small. His mother went to school with my daughter. And his face has always been the kind that shows what he's thinking, which makes him an honest person and a poor card player. I think it does, he said. I think that's why they gave it one. I didn't argue with him. He wasn't wrong. And at 68, I know when I'm not going to win a conversation. I went back to the North Paddock and finished the grain check. The numbers were lower than I liked, as the A had been all morning. I made the note and filed the order. On the way back, I stopped in the east barn for a minute. The center of the aisle still held the impression of her weight in the straw. A long, broad compression, the shape of 9 weeks. I stood in the morning light and looked at it. The cold air was coming through both side doors. The water trough was still full. Then I got the muck fork and started to clean. There was a lot of barn to manage. The work was waiting. But I stopped once more, at the main doors on the way out, and I looked north, at the pale cold end sky, which was empty and clear, and the right color for the season. I filed the supply order for the North Paddock. I called Fenn at the depot and told him to close the emergency account. Then I went inside to start on dinner.